Nothing made sense. Nothing was understandable.
Coming up on Crime Files.
For 5 decades, she couldn't get answers.
There was no evidence, no suspects. I was told, move on.
Until a serial killer started talking about the women he killed.
I strangled her, and then I had to figure out where to dump her.
Richard Cottingham has been called many things.
Remorseless, heinous, despicable.
Gone by several names.
The torso killer, the Times Square killer.
But what led the prolific serial killer to the suburbs of Long Island?
He liked to take long wandering drives.
This is the story of the killer among us.
He led a double life. He was going home to his wife and kids.
And how one local community's resolve brought closure to 5 grieving families.
A homicide never gets closed unless it's solved.
Crime Files starts now.
Today is Friday, June 20th, 2014. The time now is 2:12 p.m. You and I have been speaking together off and on since 2004, correct?
Sounds about right.
Richard Cottingham was, by all accounts, a family man. He was good-looking, intelligent, and he had a charming way about him with women. If you were living across the street from Richard Cottingham, you would never have picked up on that this man was a sadistic killer. It's very, very possible that he's responsible for well over 75 murders. I mean, he looked like just another, family man going to work, getting in his car and going to work. But in reality, he was just a vicious serial killer and a predator.
I tied her hands behind her back. I strangled her. And then I had to figure out where to dump her.
It took former detective Robert Anzalotti almost 2 decades to get the notorious serial killer Richard Cottingham to admit to 7 murders in Bergen County, New Jersey.
It's very hard to explain certain things to you.
One of those confessions happened when Cottingham admitted to killing 18-year-old Irene Blaze.
When I got Richard to confess to the murder of Irene Blaze, one of the things that struck me during that confession was just his complete lack of empathy or remorse of any sort.
At any time was a knife involved?
I had a knife with me, yes.
He talks about killing a woman and raping like it's just like another day for him.
Do you recall at all sticking her in any way with the knife?
I would always have the knife out and poke them with it. But to me, it wasn't stabbing them. Just, to give them a little zing and it keeps them in line.
You just want to reach across the table and, punch him in the face.
But Anzalotti says he knew to keep his cool. He'd spent hundreds of hours playing poker and ordering takeout pizza to finally get Cottingham to this moment.
To kind of disarm him in some ways, I used to bring a poker table in and at night we'd play poker. We would just play for chips and eat pizza. He loved pizza, and it was a simple and cheap way to give him something as I was trying to get things from him.
I didn't force women to have sex. I just told them we're gonna have sex, and that was it.
Right.
I never beat them or, physically overpowered them. It wasn't necessary. I mean, once they're in a darkened area, in a wooded area, they do what you tell them to do.
It's out of fear.
Right, exactly.
Of course, I can't help but think that if he committed all of these murders here in Bergen County, how many more is he responsible for in other locations? Richard Cottingham was born in 1946. He was raised in a normal, healthy environment. Richard has told me that there was nothing outstanding in his childhood that made him the killer that he became. In 1970, he married and would come to have 3 children. Richard worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield as some type of computer programmer in the very early days of computers.
He was doing computers at a time when most people weren't familiar with them. And he started making a lot of money. He began visiting swinger clubs in Manhattan, in the Times Square area. He would go before work, he would go after work, sometimes he would go during work, and he began to meet a lot of women.
Times Square in the 1970s was not a place that you brought your children to, that's for sure. Families didn't go there. It was not the tourist attraction that we now know it as. Back then, it was nothing but a sex-fueled playground, peep shows, prostitution, adult movie theaters. You know, it was kind of a dirty place to be.
In addition, Cottingham also would like to frequent the infamous Plato's Retreat, a popular swingers lounge on Manhattan's Upper West Side.
Speaking with him on that, he almost looked like a kid on Christmas morning. His eyes lit up and started describing all the things that would go on there.
In April of 1978, Cottingham's wife would file for divorce, and two of his most infamous killings would follow.
He attributes the pending divorce and the fact that his wife was going to take the children and move away to the reason why he went into this frenzy.
The killings were infamous because of their gruesome nature, so they made a lot of news at the time.
In 1979, he raped and killed two prostitutes in a hotel room in Times Square. He beheaded both of those women and cut off their hands to try and prevent identification, and then he lit the hotel room on fire. He was trying to throw off the police. So ever since that particular case, he's been known as the Torso Killer.
But Cottingham would roam free until 1980, when he was finally arrested for attempted murder. He eventually was convicted of 5 murders in New York and New Jersey in a series of 3 trials between 1981 and 1984. But it would take 32 years before Cottingham's DNA was entered into a national database in 2016. 6 years later, DNA evidence from a 1968 Long Island murder case was retested, and investigators got a match.
We'd received a DNA hit from Richard Cottingham's profile matching the evidence of Diane Cusick.
The murder of Diane Cusick out in Long Island bore very little resemblance to the crimes that Richard was convicted of in 1980. The glaring example, of course, is that Diane was not a prostitute.
Diane was a 21-year-old mother of 1. She worked at a dance studio with small children, and on the night of her murder, she called her parents and told them that she had to stop at Green Acres Mall to get a pair of shoes.
When the mall had closed and she wasn't home yet, they got worried. They thought maybe she might have had car trouble or something like that. They went up to the mall and they saw her car, and they found her body in the back seat of the car. My grandfather didn't know if she was dead or alive. She had tape across her mouth and nose. He ripped that off. He picked up her body and ran towards Sunrise Highway to flag down help.
Cottingham would use the ruse of saying he was mall security, and then he'd get you inside your own car and then brutally beat you, sexually, rape or sodomize you, and then ultimately kill you.
But in 1968, Richard Cottingham was not on anyone's radar, and Diane Cusick's case went cold, despite the local community shaken and desperately searching.
They had like a van with one of those megaphones at the mall, announcing if anyone has any information.
In the years that followed, Darlene would be raised by her grandparents and tells me she desperately missed the mother she lost.
I had my grandmother, but I didn't have my real mother. So I should have had my mother. I was cheated. I was cheated out of that.
Is that the girl that you met on Main Street and ultimately killed that night?
Yes.
Like Robert Anzalotti, in March of 2022, Stephen Fitzpatrick and Jared Rosenblatt traveled to New Jersey to take a crack at Cottingham too. But they had what Anzalotti didn't: Cottingham's DNA evidence on their side. Plus, in the 8 years that passed, the serial killer's health had deteriorated significantly.
He was wheelchair bound. He was uncomfortable sitting in the wheelchair, but able to talk.
Authorities from Nassau County had narrowed it down to 13 murders they believed that Cottingham may have been involved with on Long Island alone.
We then went back to the time frame that he was actively killing girls. That was from 1967 to 1980, until he got caught.
He wouldn't really talk to us with any specificity on the first visit, and I advised him that he was going to get indicted and that ultimately we would come back and then he would have a decision to make.
The ace that we were holding was the DNA match. He thought we were bluffing. We weren't. We were ready to bring him back to Nassau County and stand trial for Diane Cusick.
Still ahead.
He was able to describe scenes that only the killer would have known.
Richard Cottingham keeps talking, and what he has to say,
I was completely blown away.
When crime files, The Killer Among Us, Richard Cottingham continues. Crime Files continues now with The Killer Among Us, Richard Cottingham.
The dichotomy of Richard Cottingham is he fancied himself to be a good father and a decent husband, but yet at night he was all too happy to snatch a woman right off the street and take her life.
Describe for me, how did you strangle her?
I believe I used her stockings, but that's what I normally did.
Explain that to me.
Well, when you use a pair of stockings and wrap it around the neck, it almost looks like a wire.
One woman investigators believe that Richard Cottingham also strangled was 21-year-old Mary Beth Hines. Mary Beth lived in the quiet suburb of Mineola, New York. She was one of 7 children, loved to bake, and was described as a fashionista.
She was a girly girl, in the true sense.
Mary Beth was murdered in the spring of 1972.
It was a Friday night. Mary Beth was due home from work. She never came home. The following morning, 2 detectives showed up at the front door. My mother, of course, escorted them into the kitchen, gonna have some coffee. 5 minutes later, the detectives left. Mrs. Hines, she's 21 years old. She didn't come home. There's nothing we could do.
4 days later, Mary Beth's body was discovered floating face down in a muddy creek in nearby Rockville Center, New York. She'd been strangled. Her death ruled a homicide.
It was at the base of a walk bridge. She was partially clothed. She was immersed in the water, so that kind of hampers any kind of forensics on her.
The detectives who worked on the case did the very best they could with the evidence. I was told nothing could be done. There was no suspects. The case is not going to be solved.
3 months after Mary Beth's body was discovered, 23-year-old Laverne Moy, a mother of 2, was found strangled in the same creek.
That crime scene was almost identical to Mary Beth, where it was hard to tell. You know, you knew that, she was beaten, but she was, again, pushed in a waterway.
I knew it was a serial killer. There were 2, right there.
With no suspects, both cases went unsolved. Then, a year later, not far away, Sheila Hyman was discovered, bludgeoned to death in her Long Island home.
It was a very messy scene. She had 3 children, and they were away at sleepaway camp. Her husband had left the house, and when he came home, he found his wife in a pool of blood on the floor.
5 months after that, Maria Nieves was found strangled to death too. Her body dumped near Jones Beach on Long Island.
She was an 18-year-old young woman who had come from Puerto Rico, wanted to make a better life, work here in the United States.
No one at the time even considered all 5 deaths may be related. Cottingham, the father of 3, was a killer among us, preying on women in several states.
In his early days, he was raping and killing everyday teenage girls that he would befriend walking on the street, sometimes housewives that he might have met in a bar or in a shopping mall.
So for 5 decades, the 5 Long Island cases went unsolved, the grieving families never getting any kind of closure.
I was told, move on.
Rather than move on, Jeannie made it her mission to get answers and reached out to police relentlessly. Then, after decades of reaching out, there was a breakthrough.
In February of 2022, I got a call from the Nassau County Police Department. I was completely blown away.
Jeannie Hines was about to learn investigators on Long Island now believed her sister's murderer was likely none other than Richard Cottingham.
Each one of the 4 other cases, in addition to Diane Cusick's murder, he provided specific information. For example, when we discussed ultimately the death of Maria Nieves, he described in great detail how the grass appeared in the field of Jones Beach in December 1973.
He remembered so much detail on that. The exact way he tied her up, the way he rolled her up in a carpet, where he dumped her down by the Wantor Parkway at the end by where the monument is.
He was able to tell us in the death of Sheila Hyman that the dog was outside. A little detail that was pretty unique for the case.
There was only one woman who Richard Cottingham showed any emotion for when describing her death, and that was Mary Beth Hines, who he is believed to have met before killing her.
I had found out that my sister was in New Jersey prior to when she was killed, in the same exact area as Cottingham. So it's quite possible that was where they had met.
So you believe that he came here specifically to meet back up with her?
You know, I'm not really sure, but I'm guessing yes.
I almost think he liked her, the way he spoke on her. He almost had a sigh where he was like, she was a nice girl, and he doesn't show emotion to anybody.
I think he did like a particular look, petite, slender, dark hair. In the early days, he would pick women that he felt he could gain their trust and get them to get in the car with him or get them to go to a bar with him or what have you.
I would do these things as almost like a different person doing it. And I would go into what I used to call the zone. And it wasn't me. It was like being drunk.
So if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, what was Richard Cottingham, the torso killer who lived in New Jersey, doing on Long Island in the first place?
He actually had an uncle who lived in Massapequa. We found out he was kind of a car guy. He liked to take long wandering drives, and that's how he ended up in some of these different places.
He was, in his words, smart enough to maybe take a girl from Bergen County, but dump the body in South Jersey, or maybe grab somebody in Nassau County, but dump them in New York City.
A chilling admission, but would Cottingham admit to all 5 murders under oath in a court of law? For the victims' families, there was no telling what the serial killer might do.
Still ahead.
We were all very unsure if he would go through with it or not, and we all held our breath.
Crime Files continues now with the killer among us, Richard Cottingham.
December 5th, 2022, Richard Cottingham called back to court to answer to the decades-old murder of Diane Cusick.
The day Richard Cottingham murdered my mother, the lives of all those who loved her were forever changed.
He punched her face, put tape over her mouth and nose. He then held her down and raped her.
Many in the courtroom wondered, would Cottingham not only plead guilty to murdering Diane Cusick, but also to the 4 other murders of the women on Long Island as part of a plea deal with prosecutors?
We were all very unsure if he would go through with it or not. And there were times during that session that he consulted with his attorney, and we all held our breath.
How do you wish to plead, guilty or not guilty?
There was no emotion when he was admitting to these murders. And when asked by the judge, is there anything you'd like to say? His answer was no.
No.
He understands what remorse is and that he should have it, but he has no concept of he doesn't have it. He just feels no remorse for what he did.
We tried to seek many of the answers that these families and others wanted to know. How did these young women die? Why did they die? While many of those answers can be answered, it is my hope and my office's hope that with this sentence, the answer of who is responsible for the death of your loved ones may be just enough.
Why? Why all the emotion?
50 years of questions. These families, their lives were never the same. People didn't know their mother. One family lost their mother and their father was accused. It's devastating.
My mother was a person, 23 years old, taken too early. Left my sister behind and my grandchildren, and my grandmother and my grandfather left to picking up the pieces. But I want to thank you all for your service, and thank you for solving this case and bringing some closure to our families.
They were so happy to finally have an answer, so relieved. They knew their loved ones weren't coming back. They knew they were gone. They had come to accept that. But everybody had that question of why?
But there was one family who is not there, and that is because no one has ever been able to locate relatives of Maria Nieves.
Her family did not get the piece that I got. They don't know what happened to that girl. I'm sure that somebody out there is grieving for her somewhere.
We don't close these cases. A homicide never gets closed unless it's solved. We just don't stop looking.
Do you have any reason to believe there are more cold cases that Cottingham is connected to?
Based on my conversations with him, yes. On Long Island, I don't know.
Richard Cottingham killed who he wanted, when he wanted, because he's a serial killer. That is what he is.